So I'm very pleased to be here with Dr. John Callow of the University of Suffolk, who is the author of The Last Witches of England, a tragedy of sorcery and superstition. John, it's lovely to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here, back in Bideford, where it all happened 300 years ago.
John, before we get into the story of the trial itself of these three women, I wonder if you could paint a little bit of a picture of how Bideford was at that time in the 17th century.
Well, Bideford is a fascinating boom town. It's the golden age of the place, really. Cargoes are coming in from the known world, particularly from Newfoundland for the cod fisheries, and from the American colonies carrying tobacco. So Bideford was a thriving port because it was, after London and Bristol, it was the largest tobacco carrying port in the whole country, and fortunes rose off the back of it. So there's a lot of money going around. There's a certain tension because you've got a maritime community, and of course, as we all know during this period, lives are lost at sea. It's a risky venture. So people are living in conjunction with the natural world around them. Storms are sent by God, or sometimes by the devil, as happened in the case of the Bideford witches. So there's uncertainty which underlies the basic prosperity. The town is growing, expanding and adapting. It's got lots of ale houses, tea and coffee are coming in from the Americas. But there aren't as yet the grand public spaces. It's still predominantly a medieval port, and that places, as the volume of trade grows, enormous strains on the infrastructure. So for instance, the city fathers are incredibly worried about the breakdown of law, order, seemliness that's created because of the cargoes. The things split on the quayside, tobacco, rotten vegetables, rotten fruit are piled up, and of course you get animals and scavengers. And one of the interesting things about the witchcraft case, of course, is that the witches are seen as being analogous to these little animals that are stealing, literally, from the wealth of the people that are running around there. Part of this is because of the belief in English witchcraft in familiars, little animals that could creep in unseen to places. The agents of the devil, sometimes they were seen to be demons themselves, carrying out mischief or harmful magic. But also in this case, the very kind of scavengers that you find there are seen mirroring the actions of the three women of Bideford themselves. They were begging for tobacco, they were begging for scraps of meat, they were begging for bits of bread. So those actions go into the public mind as one mirroring the other with really devastating consequences.
So thinking about the trial itself, this incident of witchcraft in Bideford, your book opens with the incursion of a familiar into the domestic space. I wonder if you'd like to kind of take up from that fabulous opening of the book and this powerful moment within this story.
Well, if you can imagine, sometimes the smallest touchstone has the greatest impact, and it was certainly the case in Bideford. A magpie turns up unbidden at the window of a merchant, shopkeeper in the town, forces its entry, and it couldn't have happened at the worst moment. The invalid, Grace Thomas, had taken to her bed. The servants and the women looking after her are cleaning out the chamber after a particularly troubled night, and are shocked by, as you say, the incursion of this animal who starts up at them. They've just about calmed down, and they're trying to work out what's happened later in the day, where there's a similar scuffling, rapping, tapping noise outside the eaves of the building. They fling open the windows of the door, and they find the old beggar woman, Temperance Lloyd, literally eavesdropping outside. So after one scare, they have a second scare. And unfortunately, and this is the tragedy, because nothing ever goes right for Temperance Lloyd, she doesn't loiter long enough for them to ask her what she was doing, what she was about, which might have resolved the problem. She takes off on her heels. And the two incidents, the fright occasioned by the magpie at the window, looking for something shiny probably, a little gem or ring to fly off to its nest, and the appearance of the old woman become inextricably linked in the minds of the whole East Church household. There is the belief that the one was occasioned by the other, and that the magpie, or, as they say in the Trial Testimony, something in the form of a magpie, became a demonic messenger, a dark magic harnessed by Temperance Lloyd. So the beggar, the old woman at the very bottom of society, who was marginal in terms of her gender, her social class, her access to wealth and education, and also her support in terms of not having a family, became completely linked in a power complex that was completely the wrong way up. Suddenly she was the dominant person in the whole narrative, and that terror, that fear of the witch is what propelled the trial. Well, when we tend to think about witchcraft, in the popular mind at least, there is a tendency to think about it being rooted in the Middle Ages, which was not a period of witch trials. It may seem really surprising. We, I think, tend to have this idea of progress and rationality, and everything gets better and better and better as we go along, when in actual fact, witchcraft in many ways was a symptom of the beginning of our modernity. It was the beginning of the modern age. And it appears in Bideford really late. It's not the stuff of the Middle Ages, it's the stuff of the birth of the Royal Society, of the Restoration comedies, of the opening up of the Americas, the age of Charles II. And that's disconcerting just to us, just as it was disconcerting at the time that it actually happened. Bideford defies our notions about witchcraft. It's an urban rather than a rural setting. It's rich as opposed to poor. It's relatively cosmopolitan. And it's right at the end of the period of the witch trials. So modernity is being born with the Royal Society, the reign of Charles II. You think of the Restoration comedies. This is the era we're dealing with. And the spectrum of people who believed in witchcraft was incredibly wide. This isn't something on a village level. It's not the stuff of country bumpkins and the uneducated. It's very much a hunt driven by the elites. Members of the Royal Society like Glanville, a last-ditch attempt really to weld together an idea of a coherent, God-ordered society that ripples down the social framework. And those who are marginal, like the Bideford witches, at the very bottom of the pile, who are marginal on account of their gender, on account of their access to wealth and education, are essentially the victims. So, the 17th century in particular is an age where ideas about God and the devil, disruption, social order and disorder are all contending. We have a society in flux. We have a society where there are still smallpox epidemics, where there are still plagues. Bideford is wide open because, of course, of the maritime trade. Shipwrecks can often be seen as the result of God's providence. In the museum here in Bideford, we have John Strange's portrait, where the man's whole life is seen as a series of God-ordered providences. Now, the flip side of a God-ordered providence, God's blessing, God looking after you, saving you, making you more prosperous, is that the devil can also interfere. The devil can hurl you down. The devil can make the child sicken in the cradle, can make the cattle die in the fields, can stop the butter from churning. So in that way, they're two sides of the same coin. And for 17th century people and 16th century people, the major sources of learning that they'd have open to them, the Bible and the great classical texts of the Roman and Greek age, all evince a strong belief in witchcraft. We have the curse of Leviticus, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. We've got the stories about Moses battling Pharaoh's magicians, turning their staffs into snakes. So everything that the people of Bideford would hear from the pulpit on a Sunday or elsewhere through the week would be reinforced with this idea of witchcraft and magic. It wasn't something on the outer margins, it was something in the centre of society. You'd, after all, had a king of England and Scotland, James VI and First, who wrote a ferocious, cutting-edge book, a real piece of reaction, called Demonology, to ram home a belief in witches. So, when people started sickening in Bideford, when their children died, where their unmarried relatives started taking to their beds, and there was absolutely no other cause offered, the physicians, the apothecaries of the town began to talk about witchcraft. There's no evidence at all, actually, that the people who called the doctors in had really suspected witchcraft before it's been suggested to them. But once that idea is set in their heads, the ball becomes rolling. After all, a person in authority says it's true, and if a person in authority says that it's correct, you can't blame people for wishing to please the betters in particular, and taking up that idea and magnifying it. The difference, of course, in Bideford is that's magnified to a murderous and damaging extent. Well, witchcraft really is about harmful magic. We've got the term for it, maleficia, which is precisely that. So at its kernel, it's damaging. It's damaging to the home, it's damaging to the hearth, it's damaging to crops, it's damaging to animals, it's damaging to your kith and kin. In a society which is still on the edge, starvation is never very far away. Epidemics are still rippling through society through all this period. Bideford has a big outbreak of the plague in 1646. There are smallpox outbreaks all the way through the Restoration period. The lines between life and death, waking up being absolutely fine in the morning and being dead by the evening, are very finely drawn in a way that I think they aren't today. So witchcraft was something to be feared, ill luck was something to be feared, and out of this is woven a whole science that we know as demonology. So James VI wrote an enormous reactionary treatise called Demonology, and that and other texts of the time take at their centre the idea of a demonic pact. What makes witchcraft really fearsome, which takes it from the level of village healers, herbalists, all those rather new age things we think of today, is the idea that magic is allied to the presence of the devil. So those very often at the bottom of the pile of society could take unto themselves powers, or the belief that they had powers, through signing a compact with the devil. Sometimes, as we see in the Scottish cases, they'd get a new name. Sometimes, as in the cases at Bideford, they'd acquire familiar spirits, little animals, sometimes big animals. We have a whole range of them in Bideford. Everything from cats, dogs, magpies, right the way up to lions are seen as being harnessed by the women. But the idea was that the familiar, given by the devil on signing of the compact or striking it, had a symbiotic relationship with the witch. It was two ways. And that the little animal, big animal, would suckle at a teat which would develop on the witch. So through the demonic pact, the witch herself would transform. She would no longer be truly human. Now, if we think about that in a modern context, that's thoroughly dehumanising somebody. Once they're no longer human, you can do inhuman things to them to stop their powers. So what do we find at Bideford? Certainly Temperance Lloyd, possibly the other women as well, although we don't know this for sure, were searched for a witch's mark, a supernumerary teat. One can imagine the impact on elderly, frightened, scared women are being stripped naked, has to be said by other women, other younger and more affluent women, to have an intimate physical examination, and lo and behold, what do you find in elderly women? You find lumps and bumps. Now, these lumps and bumps are taken to be the site of the sucklings. They've been developed through a carnal relationship with the devil that confers upon them particular powers. So, the crime of witchcraft could involve stopping the harvest, the crops would wither and die in the fields, the animals would sicken in the fields, the babe would wither and die in the cradle. And this, in one way, is why witchcraft is seen as being particularly a woman's crime. If we think about a modern crime scene investigation, where do most of the allegations of witchcraft happen? They happen around the hearth and the home. The child sickens, the butter won't churn. All kinds of things try and get into the house. So this range of suspects tend to be female rather than male. If we think of the opposite end of the spectrum, poaching tends to be a male crime. Men have a particular physicality, they have access to firearms, they go out hunting for animals when it's illegal. Now, in terms of witchcraft, if we look at the cast of people who are going to be in the home, who are going to come scratching at the door, who are going to do things that are profoundly unnerving, then unfortunately they tend to be women. This doesn't detract from the fact that this was a patriarchal society, that misogyny was deep-rooted. You only have to read certain passages of the Bible, take in the culture of Judeo-Christianity or the writings of King James and his Demonology to realise this. The idea that the woman is more carnal, is more easily swayed, is more suggestible than the man. And all of these things combine to define the idea of the witch that's bled its way into our storybook. Most famously, if we think about Walt Disney, the idea in Snow White of the crone coming tapping at the window with the basket of apples. Well, this is precisely what happens in Bideford. One of the evidences against Temperance Lloyd, and again, this is the woman's terrible tragedy. Her luck, and one of the few examples of luck that she does get, is one of the things that leads to her end. From somewhere she's able to glean a basket full of apples. And this is her whole world. This is the difference between being able to sell them, to have enough for warmth and to eat overnight, or going hungry. She's selling them in the marketplace, on the quayside, on Gunstone Lane, all the places you can still see and visit in Bideford today, when a young child pinches one of the apples from out of the basket and runs off triumphantly to her mother. The mother is a younger, far more affluent woman who thinks this is hilarious. It's part of a fun day out. The child has been a bit cheeky and it amuses her. Of course, it doesn't amuse Temperance Lloyd, who follows after, complains, argues for payment, and then when she's rejected with a cursory wave of the hand, falls to cursing. As ill luck would have it, the child falls ill and dies, and the mother links the curses to the child's death. This is how witchcraft roots itself. It's the phrase, the word said almost out of earshot, so you can't catch them, that lodge in the mind and that can turn people normally that you would feel feelings of pity for, guilt because you couldn't help them out of their straitened circumstances, into objects of fear. They're to be loathed, they're to be mistrusted, they're to be destroyed. And this is the unfortunate escalation of events that leads the three women at Bideford to the gallows at Heavytree in Exeter. One of the problems in Bideford is absolutely nobody is where they're supposed to be or quite who they're supposed to be. So the Earl of Bath, one of the Grenville family, whose family had held the manor at Bideford since the Middle Ages, has gone off down to London. He's one of Charles II's great friends, so he's become a grand courtier, and he can't really be bothered with what's happening in Bideford. Even when he's fined by the city fathers for the amount of rubbish outside his properties, he doesn't pay and he doesn't really listen. At the same time, the political elites, the Puritan families, John Strange's family, for instance, the families of potters, who literally made the wealth of the port city, who had been ruling the roost since the Civil War, are deprived of their livings, they're deprived of their power, they're purged out of the corporation. The same is true of the clergy. The Puritan rectors who had been there, the Bartlett family, are rejected. Nobody wants them after the Restoration. They're cast out, they're religious dissenters, so they've fallen in status. They literally go underground and are hunted like outlaws. The people who replace them, the new Reverend Ogleby, is a Scot, he's an outsider, he's a free thinker. He certainly doesn't deliver a fire and brimstone view of Christianity, and he's not cohesive. So if we look at the plague of Bideford just after the Civil War, Bideford society held together in terms of that enormous strain because you had local elites, a Puritan elite who thought, prayed, acted together and provided true leadership in extremis. In the 1680s, this just doesn't happen. The Stranges have been sidelined, the Puritans have been cast out of office, they've become religious dissenters, they've been hunted as outlaws. And what you get in their place is a very thin veneer of Tory leadership. They know they don't have the people behind them. They know that the people they rule over don't like them, don't worship in the same way, don't have the same values, certainly aren't as keen on the king as they are, and probably prefer Monmouth. So Bideford by the early 1680s is a real powder keg. You can't get away from the fact in Bideford, poverty was inextricably linked to the crime of witchcraft. We get a sense of the women's utter marginality in terms of their gender, in terms of their poverty, in terms of the fact they've been forsaken by their families. They are all abandoned women, sometimes through misfortune, losing a husband, being abandoned by a husband, or being abandoned, in the case of Susanna Edwards, by her own children. They're unfortunate, but that sense of them being unfortunate can turn in an instant to them being hated, despised and feared. Feared because of these things that have come together to be seen as witchcraft, the power to curse, the power to harm, the power to give the evil eye. All these things come together, and in the Bideford trial we see lots of facets of English witchcraft. We have image magic, we have the scrap of leather that's seized from the habitations of the witches. Now, what we might think of as referencing that utter poverty and degradation, you think of the constables bursting in, and all they can seize as evidence is a scrap of leather that seemed to have been pricked by thorns. But this waste object, in the eyes of the court, in the eyes of the judges, becomes an absolute piece of evidence for the prosecution. Now, what is the idea of sympathetic magic? It's rather like the idea of sticking pins in a doll. We have that in Bideford too. A stray cat brings a doll into the house of Thomas Eastchurch and leaves it on a bed, and this is seen again as image magic being worked upon his ill sister-in-law. And the idea was that the strip of leather, of course its skin, that's what it had been, represents the victim's skin, which is then pricked by thorns or little pins or awls as they're described. Grace Thomas takes to her bed, and one of the symptoms of her illness is a pricking feeling, the feeling that she's constantly being pricked by needles day and night. She can't sleep, she can't get any rest. So the things are linked. It's a bit like Temperance Lloyd being linked to the magpie. So one action mirrors the other with really terrifying effect. We have in Bideford the occasion of familiar spirits, this particularly English version of witchcraft, where little animals scurrying, trying to get in at the windows. That's why sometimes even fleas are taken to be demons in disguise. But any little animal burrowing in, breaching the safety of the home, that's why very often the entry points, the things where a witch can get in, are at the windows, the chimneys, the doors. That's where we have counter magic and protection. Put up witch bottles, or we have witch balls in the window sometimes to avert the evil eye. So the protection of the household is incredibly important as well. There is a sense all the way through the Bideford trials that the home, the private space, in an age where there isn't really much private space, is being invaded, that the three beggar women are pushing the bounds, and they're also pushing the physical and geographic bounds. Mary Trembles and Susanna Edwards are incredibly unlucky, just like Temperance Lloyd. They obviously had a habitual round of begging. They beg in a pair. Now that's obvious as to why they did it, for safety from sexual and physical assault. So they go around as a duo. They were used to begging where they could get tobacco, where they could get food, possibly a bit of ale. But on one particular day, they turn up at exactly the wrong time. Instead of the seaman who owned the place, who would always give them something to go away or invite them in to warm themselves by the fire, they run into his wife for the first time, who goes mad at them, who throws them out. They walk around the town for several hours, they get cold, they get bored, they try their luck again. They go back up to the same door, they find not the sailor, but again his wife, and things escalate. Curses are thrown around, and the idea that they had cursed that household again embodies itself and embeds itself on the community. So a combination of bad luck, harsh words, and dire poverty are all key to the Bideford case. We're very lucky here in Bideford because the port didn't really outgrow its 17th century boundaries. You can still walk through the streets that the witches would have known, where they were spotted, where they begged, where they faced the fury of the crowd. I think the closest place you can get to them that they would have known, and which isn't too much change, which would have been utterly familiar to them, of course, is St Mary's Church. Some of the monuments on the walls to John Strange and to Hyman the Merchant are to people that they would actually have known. The paint, the gilding on Hyman's amazing monument there would have been new when Temperance Lloyd was brought there by a howling mob. They try and get her to recite the Lord's Prayer in front of the vicar, and lo and behold, under duress, she stumbles over the words, and this is seen as proof of witchcraft. The font there was where Susanna Edwards had been baptised. You can see the rise and fall of the church in England by the fact that at the time Temperance Lloyd was being married in that church, the font had been thrown out into the street by the Puritans, used as a pig trough. Those are the major physical things that can bring you into stark contact with the witches. Touch that font in the church, and you are touching something that Susanna Edwards would have touched as an infant. Look around the walls of the monuments. Those are the things that Temperance Lloyd would have seen on a Sunday. Those things are still with us. Of course, Bideford was defined, and it was defined for the witches as well, by its Long Bridge. They would have known its span, its shape, the torrid waters that did so much to bring prosperity into Bideford. We've got Gunstone Lane. I mean, it's still a steep walk today. Temperance Lloyd was supposed to have met the devil going up there, carrying a bundle of sticks for kindling that she was hoping to sell. And you can see the devastation and the degradation of the old woman, that the devil appears to her at a moment of crisis, offering to take her load. This is probably a journey she'd have done every day. But walk up Gunstone Lane, other than replacing the tiles with thatch, you can get a pretty good view and a pretty good idea of what she would have experienced just through the simple physicality of taking that walk and getting out of breath by the time you get to the top. For the Victorians, they thought that the witch's cottage was right at the top of the town by the new cemetery. Unfortunately, it burned down in the Victorian period. We've only got chocolate box pictures of what it looked like. It's highly unlikely that the women ever lived there. It's far too much of a substantial dwelling, and certainly there's absolutely no evidence that the three Bideford women did anything other than beg together. Certainly Temperance Lloyd struck out on her own. She was seen as the dominant one. The other two women had a closer connection, but the idea that they all lived together, I think, is a fallacy. It's a fallacy by modern writers, modern playwrights, modern radio journalists. It fits the picture of a coven, but it doesn't actually fit with the women's lives. The Civil War fort, the other side of the water, is something that two of the women, Susanna Edwards and Temperance Lloyd, would have seen being built. It's possible that Temperance Lloyd's husband, who was a Welsh miner who'd come to the port at the time of the Civil War, may have even been drafted in to help dig. It's not too far to say that who were experienced people in digging, moving earth, well, you'd use the local miners. So you can get a very, very good sense of the material fabric of the witches' lives just through moving through the streets. They're still more or less on the same street plan. What we lack, however, because of the massive redevelopment around about 1700 that transformed Bideford, that Daniel Defoe saw and remarked on so poignantly, is that the earlier medieval town, the early modern town of the Elizabethan and Stuart age, was eclipsed and was largely rebuilt by 1700. So that's why the witches' period is so transformative, because the small gardens, the small holdings that were overgrown, where scavenging animals rambled free, are all gone by 1700. Order hasn't been restored, and in a way the tragedy of the witches is in that struggle between disorder and order, the fear of the elites, how they control people, how they control trade, how they control population, how they control the spread of wealth, and also how they control poverty, how people slip subliminally under the radar. And those people who worried them most were women who could not be governed, who had neither husband or family to look after them, who were unbridled in terms of their tongue, who wanted something in terms of meat, in terms of food, in terms of money, in terms of tobacco, and because of their physical frailty, had to fall back on their tongues as their primary weapon of defence. You put all that together and you're not too far away from the frightening witch figure, the harridan who is lawless, who can curse you and who can literally kill you with a look.
John, as a historian, you're looking back at this story and analysing and making sense of the evidence and the information and building the narrative that you present in the book. But thinking about contemporary culture and thinking about culture as it might unfold in the future, is there anything that we might learn from this event, from this history, from this particular tale of three women in Bideford in the 17th century?
Well, I think there is. I think we're at a time similarly where all the bounties of Western technological civilization still don't get us beyond fairly primal hatreds, suspicions, irrational fears of people who are a bit different. People at the bottom of the scale, people who quite literally often have nothing, but are changed into a threat, literally the enemy within. So scapegoating remains with us, unfortunately. The fear of the poor and the vulnerable. Methods actually of dealing with the poor and the vulnerable. The Bideford witches go to trial because there's no such thing as a National Health Service, there's no safety net for them. At a time when those very things are being eroded around us, at the very time when equality is growing once again, when the gap between poor and rich is growing exponentially, it doesn't take very much imagination to see that the same social and political conditions that created the witch hunts of the 17th century are not too far away from us today. All that's required is the fuse and a group of people who think differently, do things differently, who knows even look differently. And you've got all the ingredients for a modern day witch hunt. It'll be dressed up in a different name, it'll be done in a different way. But the mechanics, the irrationality, and the utter certainty of the people driving it, their role within the heart of society as opposed to the margins, will remain absolutely the same. It's no wonder, therefore, that in the 18th century, when Goya, the famous Spanish artist, was producing his own works on witchcraft, that one of his famous works is entitled The Sleep of Reason. He knew that it wasn't the demons who produced witchcraft, who produced evil, who produced terror, but human beings themselves, and that it was the sleep of reason that allowed untold horrors to happen. And the same might well be true today if we ever think to snuff out the great tradition of the European Enlightenment.